So yeah, let's start talking. What questions or thoughts popped up for people?
What are these commandments? Like, what's he referring to?
Okay.
But
Yeah.
what
Which one?
came before?
Where is
what
that?
came after? Verse 19.
Yeah.
Is it the law? Is
So-
it the Ten Commandments?
So
Like,
one
what
thing
is
to
it?
know that I'll just tell you guys real quick is when it says law or the prophets, that's the way they spoke about the entire Old Testament. So he's talking about the whole Old Testament, but it's also shorthand for like the laws and commands that come out of the Old Testament. So he's kind of like saying the whole thing and anything in it, right? If you guys need a couple more chairs, there's some up here in the front too, and there's one over there. Welcome, you guys. What else?
So like, eating bacon. This one says you can do it, but other stuff in the Bible says you can't.
Straight to the bacon.
Straight to the bacon. Wait,
all those
where?
skin diseases.
Just in
in the
general
law.
sense.
Oh, okay. Okay, keep going.
Like, a question about that would be like, what about the stuff that we do,
Yeah.
like, consider
Yeah,
normal?
what are these
Like,
commands?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The Torah and Tanakh.
Like one of the
Prophet.
don't play with
Or is it the
children.
Beatitudes? Or is it like, what
Yeah,
is he
there's-
talking about? Or is
It's
it what
the
he
first
says?
5 books of the Bible. It's the Torah.
The law and the prophets, yeah, it's the Torah and then the prophets that come after it. So it's like the Hebrew scriptures and stuff. Yeah. And like a piece of context too, there's the prophets or the Pharisees especially are like very concerned. He's like a new teacher. It's like, so are you going to contradict our scriptures? And he's like, no, I'm not contradicting them, right? Yeah, but what else?
I think verse 20 is kind of interesting. I'd love to like talk about that a little bit because maybe I just don't understand the context. But this is, to me, this is like saying something positive. Is it maybe because of what you were just talking about? With, like he's trying to like feed into what their problem is. But normally in my head, it would be like saying something like, don't be like them because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, but also like, what does it mean to be more righteous than a Pharisee? Like,
Yeah.
Is it one of his little like backhanded like, haha,
Right,
you can
right.
never be, or is it like, is it him playing into the game of the politics, or I don't know.
What are you feeling right now about it?
I don't know. That's
Okay,
why I'm
yeah,
bringing
we'll
it
t-
up.
we'll talk
I'm
about it.
curious because
Yeah.
I feel like I don't have enough context of. I just don't understand all the things going around. So it would just be like how I take it for face value, which I don't
Yeah.
think is how all the time.
We got to work this in with other things that we know about Jesus saying stuff other places
Yes.
to make it all make sense together for sure.
I think that another thing that Jesus says is that the 2 greatest commands are to love God and to love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, and also, in Scripture it says that.
And that it sums up the entire law and prophets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's another Scripture that says like, for things like kindness and generosity, there's no law.
Mhm.
So I think, for the old covenantal promises, it was all based on righteousness through the law.
Mhm.
And what Jesus is basically introducing is not breaking those covenants, which is like creating a fair and civil society that distinguishes the Israelites compared to a lot of other nations. But
Mhm.
instead of just teaching them righteousness through the law, he's now teaching them kindness, which is like above the law.
Mhm.
And I think that's why he says like, it's not just about like, it's not just about surviving. It's about like being generous, being kind, like going above and beyond. And that's how you can experience the true joys of the kingdom of heaven, right? Like
Yeah.
Jesus is not just doing everything that's within legal bounds and just, being, like righteous through the law. Like, yes, he is, compared to the Ten Commandments, that he's sinless,
Mhm.
but like he's doing a lot more than just being sinless.
Yeah, yeah.
He's actively kind. He's healing people. He's teaching people. He's loving people. He's associated with prostitutes and tax collectors. He's teaching all kinds of people, lifting up the lowly.
Yeah, and you're starting to get into the way that his righteousness is greater than the Pharisees.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's also kind of a dig on the Pharisees
Mhm.
by criticizing them, saying that they won't go to heaven because they don't have enough righteousness.
Yeah. Totally.
I think it's interesting, like, on verse 18 where it says, like, we will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. accomplished. It's like hyper foreshadowing right there. Like I feel like he's talking
Yeah.
so like he's like holding the law of the Torah in like such high regard in this
Mhm.
one instance, knowing that in the future, like I don't know, there's gonna be some irrelevance to that. I
Yeah.
don't know, right? It's just interesting too because he's always so antagonistic with like the Pharisees, and it's like he's kind of on the same wavelength during this part. At least it feels like.
Well, yeah, he's like, I love the Old Testament and the scriptures, but you guys have, like, you got to do better than you guys are doing.
Yeah.
And none of it's going to go away until I've fully fulfilled it, which
Yeah.
is like, yeah, we'll talk about what that means. But
Yeah, how do you accomplish the law? I mean, how do you do that? They're just, and kind of separately in that second paragraph, he's talking about being subject to judgment, and I'm not sure what that means. And then finally, what?
Wait, where's the subject to judgment?
Verse 21 and verse 2. Anyone who
Oh, yeah,
is
okay,
subject
yeah.
to judgment, anyone who's angry. And then to continue that, well, raka is not a word in English, so what does that word mean?
Yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there.
And then also you fool. Both of those are apparently, I don't know, insults.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if I say to someone, you fool, like, I feel like I'm in Monty Python or something. It doesn't feel very serious. So,
Dude, the fire.
so that it's like, oh my gosh.
Okay.
That's not great. Yeah, something
I mean,
like
my
that.
kids have called each other idiots, so.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, this is a pretty low bar.
Yeah.
Is no one? How is so? No one's bringing up like the hell thing. Like, if you say you fool, you will go to hell.
Yeah. That's what
Does anyone?
You'll be in danger of the fire.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. You'll be in danger of the fire of hell. That is very different. You're right.
The fire.
But does anyone have
But
feelings
there's
about
a
that
very
word?
intense. That's an intense consequence.
Yeah.
Slash image.
Yeah, it's extremely intense. It's very scary.
Bring us back, Garrison.
and my question is, which of the three Greek words for hell is being translated here?
We're gonna get into that in a second. Gehenna, we're about to go there, but I'll let you get one last question, then we'll start.
Go to Gehenna.
He knows what's
We're going to Gehenna. Let's go. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like, you know, it's like, I think it's fairly obvious or fair to say that like most of us are gonna sin throughout our lives, like even though we know what not to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like what Jesus is almost saying here is that like, the last words that come out of your mouth shouldn't be a curse, or like, to say that someone is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I think like you should always be striving to say and do good things. And so it's like he's almost like making a complete warning. Like there's no like yes, you might come in times of judging people or like rebuking people or even getting into arguments or getting angry at somebody, but like the last words that should come out of your mouth should be kind, I think, is like more of what he's saying. I think we all kind of like subconsciously think that like, oh, the last thing you do, you know, in your life is a sin, like murdering somebody or something, like you're probably gonna go to hell. But like if you live your life in repentance and you live your life experiencing the true joys and the fruits of kindness and love, then it's like that's gonna lead you for the rest of your life. And I think we should make every effort to like not allow like harsh or destructive or evil things to come.
Well, okay. So there's a bunch of context that I'm about to drop on you guys about this word hell. All right, you ready? So we're gonna do that. We're gonna do that first because I know that's burning a hole in people's brains. That hell word. So, and in like unless you heard the most recent episode of the Bible Project, this is gonna probably open some minds up. If you listen to the most recent Bible Project, you can probably space out for the next 5 minutes. That's fine. But okay, so the word is Gehenna, and pretty much anytime Jesus talks about hell, that's the word that he's using. And Gehenna, the translation of that is not afterlife place where demons torture you. That was made up way later, right? So Gehenna is, are you guys ready?
Yeah.
It's the Valley of Hinnom. It's the Valley of Hinnom. And it's translated for us, well, the word was Gehenna, but it used to be Ben Hinnom, but it got shortened it was the name of somebody who had owned it previously. But basically, it's a valley that's in the southwest corner of Jerusalem. It's still there to this day. You can still go and visit it.
What's up, Palestine?
Yeah, what's up, Palestine? So, and it's about a mile away from where Jesus was actually murdered. So, like, Jesus is up on this hill called Golgotha, and Ben Hinnom is just like kind of basically the valley right below it, which is kind of interesting. It's something that I'm going to bring back in a second. But so the valley of Hinnom, he's obviously using it as a metaphor. And so, what does that metaphor mean? So, it's talked about 3 places earlier in the Old Testament. So, in 2 Chronicles 28, there's this king Ahaz, and he is a terrible king. He is a descendant of David. He's leading the Jewish people, and he goes and he makes these molten images to the god Baal in the valley of Hinnom, and then he burns his children in a fire in the valley of Hinnom as a sacrifice to these molten images, right? This is 2 Chronicles 28. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. So that's the first real event that happens there. And then the next big event that happens there is the king Manasseh in 2 Chronicles 33. A couple generations later, the king does the exact same thing. He goes out there, he sacrifices his children in the fire to these false gods. And this is like, according to the Bible Project, like, and I think this is probably true, this is like the main text that Jesus is referring to when he talks about the Valley of Hinnom. It's Jeremiah 7:30. Jeremiah declares God's judgment on these kings. And he says, "The people of Judah have done evil in my eyes, declares the Lord. They have set up their detestable idols in the house that bears my name and have defiled it. They have built the high places of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. Something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind." God doesn't love it when we burn our children up. Something we don't need clarified, but different time, different place, right? So beware, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the people will no longer call it Topheth or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter, for they will bury their dead in Topheth until there is no more room. Then the carcasses of this people will become food for the birds and the wild animals, and there will be no one to frighten them away. So it's this really gruesome scene that he's calling up for its shock value. It's probably not saying like a really specific thing about this is what the afterlife is like. He's talking about an actual valley where a really gruesome scene happened, right? But it's this place where God's going to invert, where these terrible kings have taken innocent lives and burned people. He's going to invert that, and the people who started those fires, their bodies will be thrown into that valley, is what it's saying. And so, knowing that, so we hear the word hell, and we think all this like Dante, afterlife, demons torturing someone, and okay, that's something that is a newer creation. Knowing that he's talking about this valley where there were kings who burned their children alive, God says that's a detestable practice that I hate, and the Babylonians are going to come and they're going to throw your bodies in where you have done this to your children. 2 questions out of that. 1, how does that change your idea of what hell is? And 2, what do you think Jesus might have been trying to convey with that metaphor? Answer either of those.
Say it one more time, both of them.
How does it change your idea of hell, knowing about this valley thing? And 2, what do you think Jesus might have been trying to convey with the metaphor?
Well, it's kind of like if someone was preaching today and they referenced like Chernobyl, right? Like,
yeah,
you're in danger of Chernobyl.
Yeah, the fires of Chernobyl.
Yeah, like I don't know.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Or recreating another scenario where it can lead to another Chernobyl. That's you're creating it, but you're like planting the seeds for that to flourish later on. Also dangerous.
And And is there a modern example of like somebody doing something awful and then that same awful thing coming back, and them kind of dying in that same place, or?
No, Fukushima is just a power plant. I think.
it's doing something.
And it's,
I mean,
it's also
hey,
interesting,
we're
right, that
done.
it's the fires of Gehenna, but the fires were lit by the people.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a really close analogy, but there certainly are, dictators who, lived by the sword and died by the
Yeah,
sword.
yeah.
Yeah.
That happens a lot.
That's what this is,
And
yeah.
that's sort of what it sounds like,
The Battle of Wounded Knee.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah,
Any
this is all very real.
how does that change your kind of vision of what hell means?
I think he's maybe like, I don't know, I actually don't know what he exactly is saying yet, but the vibe that I'm getting is more of like, overall, come to me, rely on me, because you are just gonna F it up for yourselves.
Yeah.
And it starts with these thoughts. It starts with these
Yeah.
words. It starts with these small things, and then it ends up with this huge consequence of suffering and
Mhm.
death and all of this. So just come to me with that stuff instead of trying to like figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if this is like the place where the most depraved historical figures went, if that's your shorthand, like, I don't know, the Nuremberg trials is kind of what I'm thinking of, but that's not a super great analogy. But if you're in danger of the firing squad, to use some semi-relevant example, and anyone who says you fool will be in danger of eventually going in front of the fire squad, that sort of reversal that Jeremiah did, it does kind of sound like you might think you're not saying something really very serious, but pretty quickly it gets really serious. You're going to be just like those kings of old who were thrown on a trash heap and burned,
Yeah.
I guess that sort of seems to be like what it's getting at.
Yeah, and if you look at what this text literally says, it doesn't say like the Christian pop culture version that has been translated. I don't know how a lot of people have gotten this into our minds, but it's in there where it's like hell is for people who missed a technicality of not being able to have an altar call. But what this literally says is if you call someone a fool, you're in danger of the fire that leads to this horrible outcome of
we've seen examples of that in history. Like, people that embrace like evil and violence end up often like very evil and violent and unhappy and tortured themselves, right? Like,
yeah,
it's just like when we let evil into our lives, it's not great.
It's a self-harm thing. So Tim Mackey's take on it, he's the Bible Project guy, he was like, that what Jesus is after and why he's using this as a symbol of divine retribution is he's trying to say that there's like a measure for measure balance that God brings with his justice, where the evil that you do to the innocent comes back on you. That sin is this kind of like self-harming thing that when you try to harm someone else, you light a fire that you fall into it. And so that actually lines up with early depictions of Gehenna that we see in both Jewish apocalyptic art and like early Christian apocalyptic art. It's people who have done horrible things having those horrible things like done to them back. And so fire is associated with Gehenna, but they're lit by the people. And it's this image of the fires that you use to consume your innocent children are coming back on you, right? And obviously Jesus is going after this image because of its shock value, not to say something specific about how the afterlife works. And I think the way that it's working here within the passage, which is kind of what you're going at, and I agree with the way the vibe you're kind of getting from it, which is that when you disrespect the value of another person, you call them a fool or something like that, it's beginning the type of fire within your soul that can fall back on you. And even thinking about how these kings were killing their own children and ending their own like lines and defiling their relationship to God, it's showing how like sin is this self-harm, that the ways that we actually try to harm other people come back at us, and the ways we disfigure other people disfigure our own souls, right? And this is another thing that I noticed, that maybe this is take this with a grain of salt because I haven't seen any other commentators make this interpretive move. This is just like Caleb's conjecture here. But this got me thinking about how there was another child sacrifice that was done named Jesus, like literally a mile away, where like this is the valley and like up above it. So in this valley below, we have God saying like this detestable thing was done that would never enter my mind, where you are sacrificing your children to appease the gods. That is so horrible to me. That would never enter my mind. But what did enter his mind is I would sacrifice my son to have you. What did happen was instead of humans sacrificing themselves to get right with God, God sacrifices himself for us, right? And so even in this, I wonder if he wants in this hell metaphor us to be thinking even about the way that God's mercy overwhelms justice and how there is a child sacrifice that happens a mile away from the valley. I don't know, I might be going galaxy brain, but yeah, what do you want to say?
That makes me think like, you know, originally like humanity was meant to be in a pure relationship with God where we walked in his presence. And it was only until like we broke the commands that like we severed that relationship. And, you know, even though God obviously knew where Adam and Eve were, he was like, where are you? It's almost like God in some ways is like a baby who can't comprehend evil sometimes. And it's like until the evil has been comprehended, then God reacts in some ways. And he's like, oh, like you hid yourselves in your shame, you covered yourselves in fig leaves, I'll give you something better. And then so he gives them animal skins to wear as clothing. And it's like, now that we've sinned, it's like he wouldn't have ever imagined this to happen, but since we've sinned, now he's sending his son to die on the cross. And it's like, it's almost like we do a bad thing, and then he does something that's almost as bad or like worse out of retribution for us, like to help us, to save us out of, like either that means sending innocent people to die, innocent people, prophets, saints go out, they get martyred, they get killed, they get crucified, they get tortured. Terrible things happen to really innocent people all the time. And this is God's way of trying to save people. And then it's like, I think that's one aspect, is that he has to do worse things to help us because we keep doing worse things. And it's almost like in connection with what you're saying about this justice that he kind of delivers. It's like, in addition to the worst things that you're doing to yourselves, I'll also do worse things to you because you keep lowering the bar for hell. It almost makes it feel like God is just in that way of like the bar for hell gets lowered and the bar for my salvation gets also lowered or gets increased to some extent.
Yeah, and I know that the cross is this place where justice and mercy meet, right? Like justice needs to happen and the debt needs to be paid, but God overwhelms it with his mercy, right? So anyway, I just want to close out the hell discussion with just this last thing is I'm not making some grand claim about like knowing what happens in the afterlife, but I do know that sometimes when you don't know much about hell, it can become this boogeyman where it's like, you know, it seems like some terrible technicality that if someone doesn't say the sinner's prayer, they're going to be tortured by demons forever. And that's a really stressful thing to believe, and it kind of spooks a lot of Christians now. But that idea is a puzzle piece that doesn't fit into the puzzle that Jesus is creating right here. And, you know, some people are able to cobble together some kind of idea like that. If you really want to believe that about the afterlife, you can like put scriptures together in a way for that to work probably. But it's not necessitated by scripture at all. And I love also that the way that Jesus actually is talking about hell here, it's really what it's about is just noticing how truly destructive and disfiguring sin is in our own souls where it actually matters. Not like worried about some other person, but in our own souls where we actually have responsibility to look at, like, when I denigrate another person, I'm lighting a fire in myself that is disfiguring me, right? So,
Yeah.
anyway, so we're gonna go. Okay, that's all we're talking about hell tonight. There's a bunch else here that I want to get through real quick. So, like I said, the big question for the Pharisees is, are you going to like contradict our scriptures or not? And he says it would be easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for a dot above an I to disappear from the scripture. Like, he's like, no. Like, Old Testament, he has a really high regard for the Old Testament. And this is just a quick, like, side point, which is the Old Testament is really challenging for us.
Yeah.
And all of us, right? No, maybe not all of us. Like, Joseph loves it. But, like, for most of us. But knowing how high Jesus regarded it, and the way that Jesus is going to show us that he can see the inner meaning of it and not just the laws outside of it, but the inner meaning that he's going to show that is deeper. But he respects it so much, and so the ways that he respects it so much makes me want to sit with the Old Testament more, makes me want to dismantle some of my Western entitled individualism, my captive, like, Western mindset. I think it's really helpful to sit with the Old Testament for that. That's a whole other topic. We're not really going to talk about that today, but here's what we're going to talk about. Baller claim numero uno. Jesus says, I fulfill the law. And that word, I fulfill it, it means to fill it up to fullness. Like a cup that's empty. I fill it up all the way. What does that mean? What is he saying?
It's incomplete without him.
Yeah. Tell me more about that.
He's like the filling to the law, like an Oreo stuff.
Yeah! Yeah. Because you know those cookies are nothing without that cream.
He's the only one. He's the only one that can actually do it. Also.
Yeah.
He's the only one that can live in such a way.
He's the only one that will fill the inner longing of morality that there could be a good-hearted person. He fills that up. He does it. That's the deepest one, right? What else? I like how, like, with a cup, when you fill a cup, like, the cup is useless without the liquid. You don't need it, but the liquid, you can't grasp it or consume it without the cup. And kind of in the same way, like, I feel like Jesus is saying you can't grasp who I am without the Old Testament, without these containers of, like, law and priests and sacrifices and the history of humans trying to live with God and failing at that, and prophecy. Like, Jesus would have, if you didn't have that, Jesus would be some random guy who died. There'd be no way to interpret the meaning of his life. And then I have more, but he has his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Get it, and then I'll do mine.
Is it at the wrong time?
Yeah.
Another aspect might be the law and the prophets were waiting for Jesus.
Yeah.
Specifically,
Yeah, totally. He's filling it up.
Yeah.
He's completing it. And then on that same vibe, like, you could spend a year studying this, but, like, Jesus fulfills the narratives of the Old Testament in all these ways. Like, Jesus is the real David that takes on the Goliath of sin. Jesus is the real Moses who leads his people out of bondage. Jesus is the real Joseph who was thrown into the pit by his brothers. He's the real Esther that risks his power and his kingdom to save his people. He's the real priest who atones for the sins of the people. He's the real king, and on and on and on. Like, all these narratives, these Old Testament narratives, he fills them up. But yeah, back to the one that Deanna listed of Jesus is the only one to actually, like, do the good thing and show that, like, being a good-hearted person is possible. So let's get into this one. Jesus, what do you think that he means when he says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, these people who are just insanely dedicated to getting things right, made their whole life about it, unless your righteousness is greater than them, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of the skies. In what ways is that true?
Saved by works,
Yeah.
which is what they were doing.
Yeah.
They were doing the works, but not the spirit.
Amen, man.
And they were preventing other people from getting in, from getting access to God. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Gentiles were not welcome in the temple. Like, you had to do, poor people probably couldn't always come because they didn't have appropriate like they didn't have the money for the sacrifices. Like, there was ways that they were excluding people from God.
Yeah.
I think it feels to me like there's kind of a double meaning
Yeah.
And there's probably like 1,000 meanings to it, but so on the one hand, I feel like he's saying these guys are doing the law about as well as any human can, at least from the letter perspective. Like, I'm tithing this exact amount of this and that. And he's like, so if you want to depend on the law, you're going to need to do even better than them. Basically, like hyperbole, like it's impossible. And then on the other hand, he's saying, but you can get into the kingdom of heaven. That's his whole thing. And so he's saying,
Yeah, he started this out with blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
yeah. And so,
poor,
how do you get more
spiritually poor
righteousness?
people can get in there, but you
Yeah.
got to be better than the Pharisees.
Yeah. So the way that your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees is clearly by doing something other than what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's these two senses. The one that you were talking about, which is substitution. It's like Jesus trades places, and it's like, don't try to fill up your own cup, man. Let Jesus fill it up. You're not going to do it. Like God, like he's let him be your record. That's the grace thing, right? But then the second thing too that both you and Garrison were kind of hitting on, which is there actually is a greater version of love that you can live out, and that when you stop doing the like fear and shame based relationship to the moral law, and instead let yourself be like a wounded person that is on the same level as other people and love them in that space, that there's a way more beautiful life that you can live. And that's what he starts getting at. And it's what Jesus calls a greater righteousness, and it's a greater vibe. And so what follows is Jesus is going to do 6 case studies where he takes an Old Testament law, or he says, you have heard it said this, but I tell you this. So there's going to be 6 of them in a row. We're just doing the first one tonight, and then we'll hopefully keep doing the other ones in the next weeks. But what he's going to do is he's going to quote a rule from the Old Testament and then show the inner meaning of the law that is deeper and harder, but also more beautiful. And it's a vibe check, I think. So tonight we're going to do just a few minutes on the case study 1, and it is murder. Probably a commandment most of us are doing pretty well on. Am I right? Are we walking in victory in regards to murder? Yeah? Any murderers in the house? Shout out to my murderers! So Jesus is like, you've done that, great. But then he starts tightening his grip up real quick, and it's stuff that all of us have done, right? And he does this interesting thing where he starts listing smaller and smaller offenses, but starts listing higher and higher punishments or consequences. So the first one is like if you rage against a person, and it's kind of like a murderous rage, the kind of emotion that could lead to murder. Then he says if you call someone raka, which you're wondering what this word means. Sorry for stopping you guys. That was an invasion of your personal privacy. I'm sorry.
Well, not privacy, but space. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Raka. This is I'm gonna really like lean into the meaning this one here to close out on. This is like it. But raka means calling somebody a nothing. Means you worthless person, or you nothing, right? And then the last one is call someone a fool. So it's an insult. So the offenses are going down from rage down to contempt down to insult, but the consequences are going up. The first one is court. The second one is the Sanhedrin, which is like the Supreme Court, and then the third one is the Valley of Hinnom, which is what we call hell. You know, that fire that we light that burns our own souls. So why do you think that Jesus is listing smaller offenses and then escalating consequences? What's he doing there? Yeah.
Are they smaller offenses? And
Exactly.
are the consequences actually getting worse?
Yeah.
From what I'm looking at here, murder results in the same thing. You are cut off from society. You are judged.
Yeah.
If you are angry at your brother or sister, you are cut off from the family. You are cut off from society. You are judged.
Yeah.
And if you say someone's a nothing or a fool,
Totally.
you are burnt by your own self. Like you lit your fires and you are ostracizing yourself. You are damning yourself.
Yeah.
You are harming yourself in all these actions. So that like the action and the consequence is the same
Yeah.
effect.
You're thinking like Jesus, man. Yeah.
I had to read this 2 or 3 times before it even made sense, especially verse 22.
Yeah.
I kind of put them together, like 20 and 21.
Mhm.
So the like you have to be better than the Pharisees. The Pharisees don't murder anyone; they think they're fine. But
Mhm.
what the Pharisees like, it's an example of the fact that the Pharisees still can't get it.
Yeah.
That you still can't get it even if you're following the law.
Yeah.
Because the law doesn't cover this part.
For sure. Yeah.
I didn't see that gradient until you mentioned it. I kind of had mixed up the meanings on it.
Yeah, but either way, he's clearly saying that like murder is just a downstream effect of the real problem, which is looking at someone and calling them worthless. That a heart posture that could lead to that is actually what matters. And yeah, this word raka, you nothing. Like that's the real problem, is seeing somebody like that. And like even murder is an action that you can't take away somebody's soul. Like you kill someone, God's got eternity to work with. But when you treat somebody as worthless, that heart posture is a fire you've lit in your soul. That is the real problem. The problem with the sin is in us. And it's that it keeps us from the beautiful awareness of the worth of a soul. Because when you can see that, you act in love, right? And I want to read you this section from Tattoos on the Heart. There's this dude named Greg Boyle, and he started Homeboy Industries in LA. And it is this awesome thing that it takes folks who are in gangs and gives them jobs. And if I were to sum up like Greg Boyle's ministry and like just what does he really do? Like what's he about? As far as I can tell, it's kind of like he tries to see the worth in people before they see it in themselves. And just by treating people that way, these beautiful lives come out of it. And it's so cool. I love it. You guys this is a little taster. You gotta read the book. I could have read stories that are like way more tearjerkers, but this one is just kind of short, so I picked a really short one. But so he says, we choose to become what child psychiatrist Alice Miller calls enlightened witnesses. People who through their kindness, tenderness, and focused, attentive love return folks to themselves. It is a returning, not a measuring up. We don't hold the bar up and ask people to measure up to it. One simply shows up and commits to telling the truth. At Homeboy Industries, we seek to tell each person this truth. They are exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And then we watch from this privileged place as people inhabit that truth. Nothing is the same again. No bullet can pierce this. No prison walls can keep this out. And death can't touch it. It's just that huge. But much stands in the way of this liberating truth. You need to dismantle shame and disgrace, coaxing out the truth in people who've grown comfortable believing its opposite. And then he talks about how there's this song that he really liked when he was young, and a line from the song found itself permanently etched into my brain, a mantra of sorts. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. Sure, it's a song about Jesus and Christmas, but how is it not the job description of human beings seeking kinship? It's about appearing, remembering that we belong to one another, and letting souls feel their worth. 15 years ago, Bandit came to me. He had been well named by his homies, being at home in all things illegal. He was down for his barrio and put in time running up to cars and selling crack in Aliso village. He spent a lot of time locked up and had always seemed impervious to help. But then that day, 15 years ago, his resistance broke. He sat in my office and he said he was tired of being tired. I escorted him to one of our 4 job developers, and as luck would have it, they located an entry-level job in a warehouse. Unskilled, low-paying, a first job. Cut to 15 years later, Bandit calls me near closing time on Friday. He now runs the warehouse, owns his own home, is married with 3 kids. I hadn't heard from him in some time, and no news is usually good news with homies. He speaks in something like a breathless panic. Gee, you gotta bless my daughter. Is she okay, I ask? I mean, is she sick or in the hospital? No, he says. On Sunday, she's going to Humboldt College. Imagine, my oldest, my Carolina, going to college, but she's a little chaparrita, and I'm scared for her. Does somebody know what chaparrita means? It's like little one.
Shorty.
Little shorty, yeah. She's a little chaparrita, and I'm scared for her. So do you think you could give her a little send-off benediction? I schedule them to come to the next day to Dolores Mission. I situate them all in the front of the altar. Carolina planted in the middle. We encircle her, and I guide them to place their hands on her head or shoulder to touch her as we close our eyes and bow our heads. Then, as the homies would say, I do a long-ass prayer. And before we know it, we all become chilones, which means little sniffling, crying babies. Sniffling our way through this thing. I'm not entirely sure why we're all crying, except, I suppose, for the fact that Bandit and his wife don't know anybody who's gone to college except me. Certainly no one in either of one of their families. So we end the prayer, and we laugh at how mushy we all got. Wiping our tears, I turn to Carolina and ask, so what are you going to study at Humboldt? She says without missing a beat, forensic psychology. Damn, forensic psychology. Bandit chimes in, yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind. Silence. Carolina turns slowly to Bandit, holds up one hand and points to her dad, her pointing finger blocked by her other hand so he won't notice. We all notice and howl, and Bandit says, yeah, I'm going to be her first subject. We laugh and walk to the car. Everyone piles in, but Bandit hangs back. Can I tell you something, dog? I ask, standing in the parking lot. I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become. I'm proud of you. You know what, he says, eyes watering? I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife. A bueno para nada. I guess I showed them. I guess he did. And the soul feels its worth. Yeah, I feel like I've had a lot of goals in my life, but right now I just want to like help people see their worth and have this kind of laid back relationship to people that I see Greg Boyle having with people, where it's like, I don't need to make you change. Like, you're beautiful, you know how to do it. And I gotta think that being around Greg is probably a lot like what being around Jesus was like, where he just, everybody he's meeting, he sees them and he's unlocking this love in them. Like even Matthew, the guy who wrote this, right? He was a tax collector. He was selling out his people, and Jesus comes and sees something else in him. And so, yeah, when Jesus looks at you, he sees something else, right? He doesn't see, like, last night I was holding Goldie, and Goldie's my 6-year-old daughter, and she's been having a lot of trouble recently. Like, she's been having trouble with lying. She's been having trouble with bossing other kids around. Yesterday was a really hard day for her because her sister was doing a sleepover, and they came over for here for a while, and were just totally like disrespecting Goldie and just not including her and stuff. And her sisters are like best friends, and so she felt really like pretty raw last night. And I was holding her, and it just felt so good, and like I loved her so much, and I just felt like I was seeing like these problems that she's having right now of like feeling rejected and lying, and those aren't her long term. Like, I love her, and I see who she's gonna be, and I also know that the sturdiness of my love is gonna help her get there. It's like, we're good. You're gonna make it. You know what I mean? And yeah, God sees you that way. When he sees you, he doesn't see your rejections or failures. Like, he looks at you and he doesn't say raka, right? Or worthless. Like, that's what really gets under Jesus' skin, is that you could look at someone else and insult their worth, right? That's the fire that we light in ourselves, is self-immolating, right? And yeah, what did I want to say? Yeah, there's this father's heart that God wants to give you that fills the law up with something better, what Jesus calls the greater thing. that actually surpasses the perfectionism of the Pharisees, and it's a heart that sees the worth of other people's souls. This ability to see people the way that Jesus did, right? An enlightened witness whose love returns people to themselves. No bullet can pierce this. No prison walls can keep this out, and death can't touch it. It's just that huge. So let's pray.